Welcome back everyone. In this video we're going to be talking about the English people and why they are fed up of Islam. And to do this I need to talk about a lot of other things first to kind of walk you through the very beginnings and looking back at the different events that have happened in the past that has led to the riots that we see and have been seeing for the past week. The violent outbreaks of native Englishmen predominantly attacking people on the streets, attacking buildings, attacking Greggs. I'm putting this into a context that people can understand so people know exactly why these riots happened and why the UK is largely a powder keg where people are being aggressive and don't feel heard or represented and are deciding to take action in quite violent ways. Now, of course, I don't agree with violence at all in any sense. I don't think it's appropriate when people engage in violent behavior, even if they are perhaps some of the most downtrodden, poorly represented, working class people who are trying to be noticed and addressed. So let's start talking about the English in general. The English are people of whom used to be quite proud about their history, because the English, generally speaking, had a lot to be proud about. The English were well known for being those who ensured that slavery would be ended, and we weren't just those who put an end to slavery or some of the most earliest groups of people to put an end to slavery, but rather because of the empire that we had, the British Empire, we were some of the people that put an end to slavery globally. We actually used the Navy to blockade nations that we knew were engaged in selling and buying slaves. And we refused to stop doing that until that nation or nations stopped selling people. The English were proud of their inventions, people of whom advocated for great change, taking into account Judeo-Christian values and new perspectives on those values, and applying them from an ethics perspective, not just to England, but to the rest of the world, to the British Empire. Examples include William Wilberforce, John Locke, and Elizabeth Fry. England had a big impact on the world. There's no real denying it, largely because of the success of the empire. And of course, the English love their food and they love their humour, and the English of course try to spread this all over the world through the empire. Gradually, though, things changed. As part of the advancements that England engaged with, whether they originated in England or whether they came from other cultures that the English adapted, part of that was to be more tolerant and more encouraging and more open-minded to people of different cultures. The English started to consider others who came from totally different backgrounds, different perspectives, different beliefs, different religions, and wanted to have some kind of way that they could engage with those people, even have potentially even ways that the English could live with those people in a way that was tolerant, that was non-violent and was friendly, and there could be some kind of harmony, some kind of agreement. Let bygones be bygones and just treat people as humans, as individuals, as human beings. This was the beginning of a largely secular perspective of the world, not to judge people by their religion, whether you're Islamic, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, but just rely on the fact that people are human beings, and therefore we must have much in common. And that is surely more important than religious beliefs, right? As long as we act morally, why does it matter what you believe religiously? These were the kind of beliefs that the English culture started to adapt as part of the West in the last few decades. This, from its beginning, started to seem well. We got to see different cultures, different foods, different tastes, different music, different art, different language, and people are eager to take the benefits and to apply it to the rest of the UK. Fast forward to 1997. In 1997, something big happened that launched a new kind of immigration that England, predominantly England, although other parts as well, started to experience that people had never experienced before. Looking at charts, we can now look back and see exactly how many people arrived in England over such a short period of time and decided to stay in England. Going from a few thousand people coming to England as part of a net gain in immigration, generally speaking. Sometimes it was even negative. Sometimes there was a net negative amount of immigration. But now, from 1997 onwards, something happened, and under Tony Blair, who was the Prime Minister at the time as part of Labour, we started to see huge numbers of immigration. Now, immigration in and of itself isn't a negative thing, but that depends on exactly who is coming to England, who is coming to the UK. And since the UK has a very socialist kind of welfare state, we have the NHS, which is like a religion in this country, which allows people to get health care without paying for it directly. We often have people offering dental care, eye care, council housing, as well as many other kinds of free support that, as long as you are a citizen in the UK, you are entitled to. And if you can move to the UK to get those things for free, why not? I mean, if it's free, why would you not do this? It seems like a win-win, especially if you come from a country that struggles to offer even the basics like clean water or food. Well, when I go to the UK, it has everything, plus free healthcare, and maybe even a home if you get lucky enough to get a council house. And because of this, we went from having thousands of people on average on net going to England every year through immigration to getting tens of thousands of people every year. And then from that, it went to hundreds of thousands every year. Recently, the numbers are so high that it has become obscene. 600,000, 500,000 net immigration. And with that, we had totally radical and different communities with different cultures that the English had never truly interacted with before. We started to see predominantly the second largest religion in the world and started to engage with it. That is, of course, Islam. We started to see people that went against values that the overwhelming majority of the English took for granted. For example, the English took for granted that women had the freedom to go out in public and to have their faces and their hair seen. That's not the case with Islam. The English took it for granted that a woman didn't need permission from either her father, her guardian, or her husband to go outside. Not so much with Islam. It was taken for granted that a woman could work and even have a career. Again, this is something you won't find encouraged in Islam. Education, again, not encouraged in Islam for a woman. The English took it for granted that if a person wanted to leave the Christian faith predominantly, they could do this. And although many people might be upset about that, they will pray for them sincerely and do what they can to help that person. They won't go around and try and convince others that they ought to be executed. Again, with Islam, apostasy means death. But though is good news. England is a very big place. There are many cities, London, Liverpool, Manchester, Hull, Sheffield, Doncaster, so on, that a large amount of England doesn't actually engage with this tremendously large base of immigrants that have been coming to the UK for the last 25-ish years or so. This means that most English people have heard of things but have not actually experienced it. They haven't experienced an Islamic perspective. They've heard about it. They know all about the terrible things that Islam brings, and they know about the moral issues involving Muhammad, involving Aisha, the 9-year-old bride of Muhammad, and so on. But they don't really know what it means to live with that kind of community because they simply don't. There are areas in England where there are no mosques, for example. There are towns in England where there are no mosques. So England has become a very split nation where you have Muslims predominantly. Of course, there are many other immigrants as well as Muslims, but the issue that the British have predominantly is with those with a completely different culture that cannot be reconciled with the English culture. The English will not accept denying women's rights. They won't accept that. The English won't accept the general freedoms of speech and the freedoms of expression that the English have. The English won't accept that. The English won't accept apostasy laws. They won't accept that. The English won't accept cutting people's hands off if they steal. The English won't accept that. The English won't accept very low opinions of dogs because the English love their dogs. So the English won't accept that. The English won't accept not listening to music. The English won't accept not playing games that involve dice. The English won't accept the idea that you can't drink alcohol. These are all Islamic ideas that the English will not accept. In fact, for most of these things, most English people would see this as immoral to say that you cannot have these freedoms. So we now have a nation where half of England is mostly ignorant of Islam, doesn't engage with Islam, and lives happily in a very English town in the middle of nowhere. The other half of England, perhaps they are very much in the centre of London, or they're in another big city like Liverpool or Manchester, where they on a daily basis have to encounter Islam. And they don't encounter Islam for most people in the sense that they talk with Muslims or have relations with Muslims for the vast majority. And this is specifically, or perhaps especially, with women. The average male, for example, will have very little to do with a Muslim female because Muslim women are very careful not to be perceived as being indecent by speaking to men in public, for example. And they may have some Muslim friends. A lot of English people who live in big cities do have Muslim friends. The question really, though, is exactly how much do they understand the culture and how much do they really understand Islamic values? The answer is not very well. And this has led to many English people, particularly those in large cities, who are much more progressive in their way of thinking because they have a very naive view as to what Islam teaches. They don't think that Islam really teaches anything bad at all. In fact, it's all just misconceptions. It's all just people are taking the Quran out of context, or people are generalizing and stereotyping. When in reality, the Islamic perspective does actually teach these things from a theological point of view and from a practical point of view. We know this because of the census data that has been done repeatedly that shows that Muslims do indeed agree that if they have the choice, they would prefer Sharia law. If they have the choice, they would prefer to make homosexuality illegal. If they have the choice, they would prefer to punish those of whom who left the faith. Again, a lot of English people don't know this. But those who do know this are those who have to see and engage with Islam. But those who do know this are those who have had to react in some way to Islam. And this includes those who are English or perhaps Scottish or Welsh or Irish, for example, who have had to move house because the culture has been radically altered in such a way that there is no longer any English presence there. And how this normally ends up is you end up with no pubs in areas. You end up with shops that are in foreign languages, predominantly Arabic. You end up with women not being publicly visible. You end up with very public, loud calls for prayer to remind Muslims that it is time to go to mosque, to the masjid, to pray. And having lived myself in a Islamic community for a few years, I can very much tell you it's quite interesting. I once had a Muslim knock on my door and ask for Ahmed, if Ahmed was there. And I had to explain to him that actually I am part of the very few people along that street who was not a Muslim. I was like the last English person to still be there. This demonstrates the kind of divide that is happening in the UK. People are confronted with a totally different world, a world they don't recognize, a world they don't understand. In fact, for most people, a world that they passionately disagree with, morally, ethically. There is no way to compromise. The English won't compromise on this because it's embedded in their culture. Same for the Welsh, the Scottish, and the Irish. We have very similar cultural values and we simply won't abandon those. Likewise, many people who come from Islamic nations who have traveled to England or elsewhere have very passionate views themselves, who won't abandon their Islamic values and refuse to integrate into the nation they find themselves in. But what does the British government say about that? What does the British government say about people entering the UK and not integrating? Instead, they form these communities where certain parts of London or big cities or just towns become Islamic rather than English because, again, they can't reconcile. Well, there have been prime ministers and governments in which advocated for something called multiculturalism, to see the UK, and particularly England, as a place where we would accept different cultures from around the world, under the idea that tolerance and acceptance and being loving would produce a better society. It would produce a better world. England would be better for it because we are not shying away from all of the benefits that other cultures bring. Of course, the problem is they are fundamentally incompatible and we never really understood the weight of what these cultures bring. We started to forget what it means to assert the values of cultures and to reject the values of other cultures. Rather than the English culture being up here as a big thing, big plus, we started to see the English culture just average, along with every other culture. There is no difference. Because of this, we became more tolerant, more accepting, and less heavy-handed, being against certain aspects of different cultures that we were letting into the UK through immigration. So what did this immigration lead to? Well, for most people, like I said, kind of ignorance, because there's large parts of the UK that just doesn't interact with Islamic culture because it doesn't have any there. But that doesn't mean they don't watch television. And during the 2000s, there was a string of terrorist attacks that were committed by people of whom made it absolutely clear they did this for religious and, to be more clear, Islamic reasons for committing acts of terror in the UK. Whether this was the 7/7 bombings in London, whether this was the Manchester bombing at a concert where many young teenage girls lost their lives because of a suicide bomber, whether it was the terrorist attack on the London Bridge. There were a string of incidents that made people realize just how incompatible Islam was, not just with the English values, but the rest of the Western world. Not only that, but it introduced people to another idea, which was that the English are not being listened to in terms of pointing out these many issues. 1 terrorist attack, 2 terrorist attack, 3 terrorist attack. People started to realize a pattern and realize, hang on a second, we seem to be importing this and we're not actually asking people to integrate, but rather we're being accommodative. We are accommodating their values, not just in a specific sense, but a general sense. Immigrants of an Islamic background generally were being accommodated and not being told to integrate. We had Islamic areas where the overwhelming majority is Islamic, whereas many decades ago they wouldn't have been. They would have been predominantly English, particularly Judeo-Christian English. This of course all leads to the riots. Just a few days ago there was a young man who was 17 years old who decided for whatever reason to end the lives of young girls for no particular reason, it seems, although it does seem calculated given that he was armed at the time with a knife. The 3 girls that died at his hand for his absolutely disgusting and brutal attack on these children. This, for whatever reason, seemed to be the final straw with the English. It was becoming clear that those of the working class, the downtrodden, those who have predominantly been the voice of the voiceless, those who have not been heard, for many decades, had largely had enough. There began riots across England. Not only England, but other parts of the UK. But predominantly England, including shops. I think a shoe zone was violently attacked and destroyed, along with Greggs. Not sure why they attacked Greggs, but as well as police and citizens, and even people who are specifically not white. And of course these things are condemnable and should be condemned. Any form of violence isn't something to be tolerated. It was disgusting behavior to have those people go out and engage in that. The issue, of course, is that this is just a fraction of what really is going on. There are plenty of people, potentially even a silent majority of those, who have embodied the culture of the English, whether it's because their parents were English, who were previously immigrants who came to this country and they themselves have adopted English values, or perhaps they are immigrants, but they have made it clear that they believe the English cultural values are better than the nation that they left. These people feel betrayed and let down by their government because they don't feel as if these values are protected, they are represented, or they are listened to. Rather, there seems to be a two-tiering of society where you are either pro-Western values or English values, or you are against them. And instead you advocate for tolerance in the most extreme, tolerating all sorts of values, no matter how much they despise freedom of expression, freedom of speech, unveiled women, killing apostates, prohibiting alcohol, prohibiting music, prohibiting dice games, prohibiting dancing, prohibiting certain dogs, etc., etc. It's also worth noting that the rioting that happened was very much so a mix of those who were advocating against Islamic values and for English values, and those who were totally the opposite, advocating for Islamic values over English values. And by that, I predominantly mean Muslims. There were many cases of Muslims going around with weaponry, as well as the English as well. It's more about culture than it is anything to do with race. Clashing of culture that tries to reconcile itself, but it can't be reconciled because fundamentally they are so different. They are two different worlds colliding. And for too long, the policy that we've tried to deal with is that of appeasement, trying to make predominantly those who are not English appeased, content and happy with their life at the expense of putting some of the poorest of the people already in the country at risk. So there you are, ladies and gentlemen. This has just been a quick video talking about exactly what is going on in England, what the rioting is about, why has it led to acts of violence in the street, why it's something that cannot be addressed if we continue down the path of saying that tolerance is the ultimate value. We just need to be more tolerant. No, that's not going to work. Islamic values are not English values. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching this video. God bless you all. I hope that explained some of the things to people who are not aware of what's been going on in the UK. If you're not a Christian, then today is the day. Please email me at chris@speakerscorner@gmail.com if you have any questions, and I'll do my best to answer you. God bless you all. Take care.